This one got a lot of attention when I was putting the promo out for it, so I'm definitely looking forward to things taking shape tonight. Welcome back to episode 292 of the Mike the New Haven podcast. We're on the march at 300. And like I said, this one's going to be a good one. If you haven't checked out the previous episode, and that was episode 291, that was with Jerry Tracy. Now, Jerry, interesting career in the FDNY, 32 years in the FDNY. And he was the original captain of Squad 18 when it was formed back in 1998. Told a lot of great stories. He finished up as battalion chief on the job, so I was happy to hear his stories for what was volume 49 of the best, the bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. Shout out to everyone tonight tuning in via LinkedIn, YouTube, and of course, Twitter or X or whatever it is that you call it these days. Before we get into tonight's guest, who is very interesting in his own right, a couple sponsors as always. And first things first, it's not really a sponsor, but like I've always said, you have to advocate for yourself. This is my consulting company. Need advice on how to start your podcast? Frustrated with the editing process? Can't find a voiceover guy? Hi, I'm Mike Colón, and I'm here to help. I'm the owner and founder of MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company for all things media, where I can offer you consulting advice on how to get started, and once you get started, editing, as well as voiceover work, all for a very reasonable price. If you want to reach me, you can contact me at 917-781-6189 or the email that you see listed here. I'm always available, and I'm always willing to help. Again, 917-781-6189. Why go to some giant consulting firm that's going to charge you an arm and a leg when you can just come to me? If you want to be stress-free, the way to go is to call MC. MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company. You can always trust a man in a Wayne Gretzky jersey. And now for a real sponsor, he's been on this show numerous times. He's, of course, the co-executive producer of one of our miniseries, Tales from the Boom Room, profiles of the NYPD's arson, explosion, and bomb squad. And that is Bill Ryan, a retired NYPD detective out of the arson explosion squad. The Mike the New Haven podcast is proudly sponsored and supported by the Ryan Investigative Group. If you need an elite PI, look no further than the elite Ryan Investigative Group, which is run by retired NYPD detective Bill Ryan, a 20-year veteran of the department who served the majority of his career in the Detective Bureau, most notably in the Arson Explosion Squad. So if you need a PI to handle anything from fraud, legal services, and anything else that you might require, contact Bill at 347-417-1610. Again, 347-417-1610. Reach him at his website or the email that you see here. Again, if you need a PI, look no further than Bill Ryan and the Ryan Investigative Group, a proud supporter and sponsor of the Mike the New Haven podcast. Thanks to Billy. All right, my next guest got down and dirty in his 18 years as a New York City police officer. Policing's a full contact sport, as a former PBA president once said, and he certainly agrees with that sentiment. He joined the force in 2004, and he started out in Staten Island. A lot of people think that they don't work out there in Staten Island. He'll prove you wrong with the stories he's got tonight. Later rose to the rank of Lieutenant Special Assignment and ultimately retired in September of 2022, but he's still active. He's not one of these guys that left the job behind and simply disappeared. He's one half alongside Lieutenant John McCarry of the popular New York Finest and Retired and Unfiltered podcast, which I enjoy listening to and has shed a lot of light at some of the issues facing the NYPD today. And that is former retired NYPD Lieutenant, I should say, not former, Special Assignment Eric Dim, who joins us for this episode 292. Lieutenant, welcome. How are you?
Outstanding. It's an honor. It's a great opportunity to be here. Mike, I have to say, I love your introduction. Outstanding. And I love the fact you're a Rangers fan. Looks great. Thank you for having me here. Great opportunity. Thank you, everyone, for watching. I appreciate it. I hope we give you some great insight to the New York City Police Department in my career.
I think we will. And a shout out to some friends in the live chat before we begin: John Costello, John Albanese, and Steve Iorato. Thanks for your kind words about the Chief Tracy episode, Steve. It was definitely a good one indeed. So before we get into everything about your career, where did it all begin for you? Where did you grow up?
I grew up mostly in Staten Island, but also Brooklyn. was a great childhood. Rough and tumble, but definitely a great childhood.
Mhm. Builds a lot of character. Where would you say the interest in policing began for you? Did you have any family on the job? Was it somebody in the neighborhood who made an impact on you? What was it?
Well, that's a great question because the irony to it, I've turned out to be extremely interested in policing. In my retirement, I continue to research and always study about policing, probably more than most people that are actually active. But actually, the irony to that was I never had an interest in policing. It just wasn't something that I thought about. I was mostly interested in a career in the military. But as I said earlier, when I started the Finest Unfiltered along with John McCarry, he did an interview with myself, and it was an opportunity to reflect on my life. And I remember at the time, my father was always a big advocate. Get a city job. It's a great pension. And it was a great transition when I got back from Iraq. And that's when I joined the New York City Police Department. But at the time, it never piqued my interest.
Hmm. Now, were you one of those guys that just took the police test, or did you take all of them? Sanitation, fire?
That's funny. It's such a typical stereotype for a Staten Island guy is take all the city test. But no, the only city test I took was the policing test. My cousins, they took the fireman test, they took the policing test, and they waited for the first opportunity that came about. But I just took the police test, and that was it.
Hmm. Now, what's interesting is after you got back from Iraq, this is during a time, as you know, where the NYPD is changing a lot. Ray Kelly had come in a couple years before. This was right after 9/11. So not only are you now focused on common crime and combating that and making sure that that stays down, now you have the terrorism threat. And we're at the height because this is only a couple years after the tragedy of if you see something, say something. So coming in as, not your conventional rookie, you had the military background too. What was that time like for you when cops were encouraged to be proactive, but in a much different way than normal, given what had happened back in 2001?
Well, for me, it was a fantastic opportunity because I always had an interest in being self-taught and in reading. And the reason why I say that because I always believe this, and it's true. Readers are leaders, and it's synonymous. Leaders are readers. So prior to joining the New York City Police Department in the Marine Corps, that was my plan is to be a leader amongst Marines. So I went to what's called Officer Candidate School, and I worked so hard in Officer Candidate School, I actually won the honor graduate, which is there is referred to as the Commandant's Trophy. So it really piqued my interest, and I constantly researched about leadership. So it was an opportunity to lead the skills I learned to lead Marines to transpose into the police department to do good police work. And we had an opportunity to do intrusive police work where it allowed me to engage with other police officers, to lead them, even as a rookie myself. And in addition to that, to lead people to safety, to lead potential subjects, persons of interest into custody. So it was a fantastic opportunity and a great transition from the Marine Corps to the police department, especially at this time with the height of terrorism, which I was out fighting for in Iraq. So it was a great transition. I had an opportunity to serve my country and now serve my city.
Talking with retired NYPD Special Assignment Eric Dim tonight on episode 292 of the Mike the New Haven podcast. Certainly happy to have him. And if you have a question for Eric, submit it in the live chat. And at the appropriate time, I'll make sure that I get to it. Just to go back a second, and I asked this to anybody that's coming into FD or PD that has the military background. You know how hard any sort of military training can be. It is by no means a day at the beach that, even though NYPD or FDNY Academy is not easy by extension, it's a lot easier compared to what you were doing previously. So having gone through Marine Corps training, and then now transitioning into the NYPD, did you find Police Academy to be a lot easier as a result?
You know what? Right now with the podcast, I get a lot of haters. I'm going to get a lot of haters for the statement also. But absolutely, it's completely different training. The mindset and the ideology for the police department is a complete 180 from the Marine Corps. At least it was during that time. I can't speak for now. A lot has changed throughout this country. So mostly, unfortunately, the police department, the training is hands-on training and actual practical training once you're out in the field and you learn from the people around you. They mentor you. And that's where, unfortunately, that's where we fault in the police department is that we're not spending enough money and putting effort to actual training. Because in my opinion, back then, the training wasn't suffice. And now we've lowered the standards much more to a much higher degree. So it could only be even worse. So yes, at the time, I felt the academy was not up to par.
Hmm. So you come out and you're in the 120 in Staten Island. You spent just under the first 5 years of your career there. Now, again, as I was making the introduction of you, people think, oh, Staten Island, they're not working out there. You've heard the joke. Richmond County Sheriff's Office has been the running joke about NYPD cops out in Staten Island. And while some places may be quiet, like every, neighborhood, like every borough in this case, you got your quiet spots and you got your hot spots. What was the 120? Was it a mixture of both? And what was the demographic of the area that you were policing? Hispanic, white, black?
So the majority of the demographics for the 120 precinct is predominantly black and brown. There are some pockets with some Caucasian neighborhoods, but the 120 precinct itself, it does harbor, it encompasses numerous New York City Housing Authority developments. It does encompass low income, and it does encompass a majority of black and brown. So it's very diverse, and there are some neighborhoods that are extremely wealthy. It's a very interesting dynamics, the 120 precinct, unlike some other areas where you have low income neighborhoods, because you have low income neighborhoods and you can turn a corner and you're in a wealthy area. So it's really cumbersome. It's a great place to work because you get a real diverse bird's eye view into different demographics, into different areas, and how to police, because policing is not a one size fits all.
Right. Of course, there's many different demographics. As a result, you police things differently. How you police in Midtown Manhattan is not the same as how you police in the South Bronx or in Brooklyn, or in your case, out in Staten Island. So, definitely true there. Now, in this instance, from your Marine Corps training, what was one of the things they trained you on? Of course, asserting yourself, asserting your authority. Same thing here as a police officer to a different extent. You're asserting your authority. Nobody wants to be punked, because if the hoods of the neighborhood know that they can punk you, then you've already lost the battle. So, what was key? And you were working in the impact zone in your first year too, and which is why I want to ask you this. What was key for you besides your military training? And what are some of the early collars that you felt cemented yourself as somebody not to be messed with, and as a police officer to be taken seriously?
Well, that's great. That's where I saw the first character trait of being a Marine that was transposed to the police department that I thought was extremely effective. And we actually talk about this on the podcast all the time. This is something that I want to drum into the public's heads, and especially the cops. So your first sense of presence that asserts you as a police officer is your appearance. And that was so important in the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps really harps on appearance, so that you look professional in your uniform, that you carry yourself in a professional manner, and that you speak in an articulate manner. And this is so that people take you serious, and they find you trustworthy, and of course credible. The appearance is very important. We say don't judge a book by its cover, but in policing, it's one of those few professions where it's so important that you judge a book by its cover, because a police officer's presence is the first step in de-escalation. Because a police officer's presence, if he or she looks and harbors those masculine traits, and in uniform, the presence looks sharp, people understand that this is the first step to a deterrence of crime. And that's what I learned in the Marine Corps, is your presence. The way people view you is the way people will act upon you. So it's definitely a reflection.
Oh, of course, yes. And, listen, it doesn't matter who you are, even if you're not somebody who's doing anything wrong and you're walking down a street and you see a police officer there, your behavior changes a little bit. Even if you're just going about your day, because of what you mentioned, that presence, that if you're driving down the block and you see a patrol car on the corner there, maybe you were going 40 to 35, you start going 30 to 35. It changes the way you act. And like I said in the introduction as well, Commissioner Kelly had come back really with the vengeance. I think even without 9/11 having happened, that would have been his mentality. He had been commissioner before in the 90s. He felt like he had unfinished business. And this was during a time when he really had free reign to do what he wanted. And it was no doubt that he was in charge of the NYPD. So I always ask this about the Bratton years in the 90s, but also the Kelly years in the 2000s. People refer to that period as the golden age, or one of the golden ages of the NYPD. How do you feel Ray Kelly's style of policing, even with some of his flaws, benefited you as a cop?
Outstanding. Well, I think that the style of policing that really embodies the term of being a cop. It's an honor when you when you enter the police academy, it's understood, you hear from the instructors, the culture of the police department. It's an honor to be referred to as a cop because there is a difference. There are plenty of police officers, but not everyone embodies the title and earns to be a cop. And ultimately, what I could say is this: there is a dichotomy between a police officer or a cop, which ultimately you want to get to. That's the status you want, to being a security guard. And what is that dichotomy? It's that shield. That shield is iconic. And that shield is what bears the right to do intrusive police work. Now, intrusive police work is correlated to a case called People versus the Boer. And in that case, there are 4 tiers, different levels, where police officers can interact with the public, to engage the public, that are intrusive, that allows the police officer to do work. And that's what's so important. And that's when you become a cop, when you understand those 4 levels, those different tiers, to do intrusive police work. Because a security guard observes, reports, and repeats. But a police officer has to be intrusive. You use that eye, that trained eye that you get as a police officer, you transition to a cop. You use your mouthpiece to engage the public. And that is the step. That is a major key. And that's foundational in curbing crime, is intrusive police work. Most people refer to it as proactive police work. I don't like that term. I like to refer to it as intrusive police work, because proactive, we could also use semantics and say, well, it's kind of like you're looking for things to happen, and you could be overreaching. But intrusive police work is you as a police officer engaging the public. And that could be just watching them. That could be doing surveillance. That could be having a conversation, or that could be detaining someone according to the 4th Amendment, which is search and seizure. So I think it's a great tool, and that's the tool that all police, especially cops, should harbor to do police work.
No, of course. And I also think about Terry v. Ohio, the Terry stops. The police officer does not have to wait for something to happen. Now, if you've been called to something, you're in the sector car and a call comes over the air and it's already occurred. Okay, well, that's different. But if you're on patrol in the neighborhood and you're observing somebody's looking around, casing cars or doing whatever that just doesn't seem normal for that neighborhood, you could step in there and, like you said, do that intrusive police work. And maybe the guy's just, he's a little bit wacky, but he's not up to no good. He's just going about his day. But it's that intrusive police work that keeps things in check, because you see what happens to a neighborhood. Forget a city for a second, but a neighborhood, when it's not done, there's a frustration not only amongst the officers, but amongst the residents too. And that's, I think, where that discord and that disconnect grows. Now, I want to go back to your career for a second, because a few years go by, and it's around 2008, 2009. And the studying process begins. February of 2009, you end up making sergeant. Now, guys, and I always like asking this question to both FD and PD guys. Some guys come on and they know from day one, I want to give myself some time to learn my craft, but as soon as I can, I'm going to start studying, try to make rank. I want to be a boss in this job. Some guys, it comes to them later, like, let me just take the test and see what happens. What was your philosophy, given your background? Did you know from day one, I really think and I really want to be a boss in this job?
So I had no knowledge of how the police department works or the intricacies of the police department. I'm the first of my family to ever join the New York City Police Department or any form of law enforcement. I do come from a deity of military history. I've actually had great uncles that were in Pearl Harbor. I had family members, including my father, part of the Vietnam War. But we never had any experience or delved into the police department. So I was the first. So I just had an open mind, an open heart, and with open eyes. I didn't understand. I didn't know anything about the police department. But once I saw the opportunity, and with promotional exams, and I was so fortunate because a lot of it's timing. So I had 3 years on the job, 3 years total with the police academy, that I was afforded an opportunity to take the test. Now, what was so great was I never felt that I had to study in the manner that other police officers that I worked with had to really sit down and start delving into those books. And the reason why I say that is because I believe in being self-taught. So from day one, once I joined the police department, immediately I read the patrol guide every day. I started to read the book. I started to read case law. So when I had the opportunity to study for sergeant, I said, wow, I've already been reading. I've already been studying. I might as well take this test. And I already have a competitive nature. So for me, I kind of just transitioned to it. I didn't feel that I was really cramming for a test. I felt I was reading all along. Now I have an opportunity to actually challenge myself and use the leadership skills I learned in the Marine Corps to move on. And of course, there's financial benefits to it. So why not be at the top of the pecking order where you could actually affect change and you could actually lead? Because those are the skills that I take pride in. Leadership. I think leadership embodies any organization that is effective. If you look at leadership, any organization that's effective, the leadership should take credit for it. But any organization that's failing, we need to look at leadership as well. So I was willing to take that responsibility.
Right. No, listen, the identity of an organization, whatever that organization may be, as you said, is based on that leadership. You know, you and I are both New York Rangers fans. Mark Messier. Mark Messier getting to the Rangers in 1991 completely changed the identity of that team. Here he was, a ferocious, intense competitor. And if they didn't have those traits before, they developed them. And in 1994, what happened? They did something they hadn't done in 54 years. They won the Stanley Cup. So it's something that pays dividends, like you said, and that's a sports analogy. This applies to policing. When you have great leadership, not even at the top with police commissioners and chiefs of department and things of that nature, but definitely on the ground level with sergeants, with lieutenants, with captains, it goes a long way. Now, it's bittersweet because making sergeant is great, but as is the case in New York City, whenever you make sergeant, unless it's a very special circumstance, you have to leave your command. And I'm sure you love the 120, so that couldn't have been easy, but you're ready for the new challenge. And it is happy in the sense that, hey, you made the rank, you passed the test. Now you got to prove yourself as a sergeant. Now, you started out, at least for the first 6 months, in the East Village. And I've always said, going from anywhere, and this is no disrespect to any of the other boroughs, they're all fantastic, but going from anywhere to Manhattan, no matter where it is in Manhattan, is an entirely different world. So having gone from the 120 in Staten Island to the East Village, was there a bit of a culture shock or was it business as usual?
Well, that's a great question, actually. But I have a good story. I just want to tell a brief
Sure.
story real quick.
Go ahead.
So it's quite interesting. My career was just full of ups and downs, but I always take things with a grain of salt and I just laugh at it. That's the way I've always been. I can, people always say what they love about me is, if I went to my house and saw it was on fire, I would say, you know what, let's just go grab dinner. So that's always the way I've been. I'm good at taking the punches. So, but actually, so January of 2009 gave me my 5 years in the New York City Police Department. Because with the police academy, which is 6 months, that's one of the requirements. You have to have 5 years employed by the New York City Police Department to actually get promoted to sergeant. So I took the test with 3 years on the job. So I had to wait 2 years. And I happened to do well. I was number 69 on the list. So at the time, they put 75 in the first class. So even though that class had came about, I still had to wait 2 years because I didn't have the requirements yet of 5 years. But once 5 years hit, here it was January 2009, and I went to what they call BMOCs, the basic module officers course for the sergeants, where they learn leadership. Well, at least they're supposed to learn leadership, but you really don't. It's more of a seminar course. That's probably a story for another day. But so I went in January 2009, and halfway through, at the time, the deputy commissioner of budget came to our class and said, unfortunately, due to budget cuts, we can't promote you. So there were, yeah. So there were some sad faces, and some people were pretty close to tears because they've already burned bridges. They flipped the bird to a couple people on the way out of their old commands. So sure enough, we finished the course, but we were not promoted, and I was sent back to the 120 precinct. And you can imagine the police department, it's about breaking your shoes, right? So I went back to the 120 precinct. And next thing you know, one day I look at my locker and there's all these corporal chevrons glued to it. I mean, it was hysterical. So they put me on the desk. Here I am in my police uniform, my cop uniform. I don't have any sergeant ranks, but I finished the course. Everyone's abusing me. I mean, it's hysterical. They were making fun of me left and right. So they put me on the desk. And one of the sergeants goes, I'm going upstairs. I'm taking a nap. He gives me his shield. And also underneath your shield is a nameplate. So they put almost sergeant. They put it on my nameplate. They left me on the desk. It was hysterical. And they didn't give us a date and tell us when we're going to get promoted. We just had to wait. Sure enough, 5 weeks later, they called me and I actually got promoted. So that's my great story that I wanted to tell.
Pretty good.
Sure enough, I was happy. I was, full of laughs. I was like, thank God I didn't burn my bridges. So sure enough, I went to the East Village, and it wasn't a culture shock on the type of policing because the 120 precinct is a really interesting dynamic. Staten Island does have this stereotype that cops aren't doing work, and the 112 precinct is extremely busy with violence, shootings, illegal firearms, and also burglaries and various types of crimes. And you meet various different types of people. We had a community there that was it's one of the largest Liberian communities in the entire country in the 112 precinct. And so we've met people that really suffered from civil war in Liberia. And then you just have different walks of life in the 112 precinct. And so I felt I really was prepared when I went to the East Village. And I was. And it was a different dynamic, though. Sometimes when you're pursuing potential subjects, it was better to get on foot, or I would use a bicycle. So the mode of transportation changed because it's such a heavy metropolis. And now I was assigned to housing. I was in the 112 precinct where we did have some housing, but assigned to the East Village, that was my extreme forte. So you had to learn that you're not just a police officer now, but you're also a custodian of the New York City housing development. So there, I started to learn a lot. It was a great opportunity. I mean, working in the East Village, you get all types of crazy people, interesting people. You meet a lot of famous people. It was a lot of fun. I would say that East Village is probably the best place that you could work in the New York City Police Department. You have a great mix. I would say you could get on the same corner. You could get someone that would be doing drugs right in the middle of the street, someone in $1 million suit, someone selling something, someone committing a crime. It was a very interesting dynamic, and I loved working there.
No, of course. You mentioning that, I laugh a little bit because I think of my friends from the old New York City Housing Police. That was really the spirit of their department. I know they're shedding a tear right now because they missed that pre-merge, and even some of them that got to still work at the Housing Bureau post-merge, because that's really what it was for them back in the day. It was about seeing unique places like that, but also being a custodian for NYCHA, not in the sense that it's menial work, but you go into those projects and you get to know people. And it's not just about the bad people you're encountering, it's about the good people who make up 90% of those projects. So for you, I know community is something that kind of gets thrown around a lot in policing these days, and it has different meanings for some. But for you, what was your perception of community policing, and what was your version of community policing to where, yeah, I got to be the police, but I got to build bridges too?
Outstanding question. It's so important. So I like to explain this and just go back to where we were when Bratton came back to the police department for his second term as police commissioner. And we started this program of neighbor coordination officer program. We're supposed to be community based, and people would be specifically assigned in addition to our community affairs bureau. Now, what I can say is this, and this is so important to understand. Every cop should embody the different facets, the different adversarial characteristics and traits that you need to be an excellent cop. That means doing intrusive police work and also addressing the community. We don't need a specialized unit just for community in the neighbor coordination officer program. Everyone should embody that. And you learn that extremely quick when you're assigned to housing. And here's the reason why. When you're working at a precinct, especially the East Village, it's very transient. People come and go. You have all walks of life. You have people there doing Airbnbs, people on vacation, people just coming through, tourists. So it's very transient. So people come and go. So you could have a negative interaction with someone and they may never come back. It's almost like having a business. But when you work in housing, you work in someone's backyard. It's almost you're working in their home. So you really get to know these people. So it's so important that your interactions are positive because these people need to become your alliances, especially when you're working in housing. It's so confusing, the addresses, your location. So you really rely on the community there and it's happened where you're in a arrest situation and it becomes volatile and you're in a physical confrontation. You really sometimes rely on the community there to help you, especially when the police officers are responding, to help you and guide them where to go to find you. Because sometimes the way the New York City Housing Authority developments are designed, if you ever notice, the buildings aren't directly on the street. They're kind of set in. You have to really find your way around. There's signs where the addresses are, but it's extremely convoluted. So you rely on the community, you get to know them, you see these people day in and day out. They know you and you know them, and you build a relationship. That's the key to success in business, in the police department, in the military, and in policing, is building relationships.
hmm Yeah, those are the proving grounds. You ever want to learn how to be a cop, as you said earlier, work at a place like that where it's uncomfortable to a degree. And that's not a knock on the housing projects or the people that live there. It's just a fact, like you said, they're set in. It's kind of like a fortress, right? You're going in to a fortress, and some people may look at you as an enemy soldier. But as you build those relationships, that gradually becomes the opposite of their perception of you. And you leave there with a great taste in your mouth, to where so many people either pre-merge with the NYPD in 1995 or post-merge with the NYPD in 95 who have worked in the housing bureau or for the old housing police loved their time there, loved it. And they've called it the best kept secret in policing for a lot of the reasons that you've mentioned.
Well, again, as I said earlier, I believe in being self-taught. I do have a bachelor's degree in college. I went to the Marine Corps and I've learned so much that I was taught. But I think it's important that we're self-taught and we do something every day where we read something or we do something that could be beneficial to learn something. Just doing your podcast alone, because I have a podcast, I learned so much on how you run your podcast. I was watching your introduction. I've been watching your style, your speaking, your actual setup. It's so important. I believe that we can learn things from people that know more than us and things that people that even if they know less than us, someone has something to benefit. So I decided I'm working in housing, and I found this book. It was called Gang Leader for a Day. And I read the book. It's a fantastic book. If anyone ever has an opportunity to read it. And it's about this young man who's actually in the University of Chicago. And he gets this assignment. It's a dissertation. And the assignment is, what is it like to be black in urban America? So he decides to go to the housing developments in Chicago, and he goes with a clipboard and he's asked the most ridiculous questions. What's it like to be black in America? So there's a group of guys there, and they're basically hanging out in a lobby. And so they just start laughing at him, like, give me this clipboard. What are you asking here? So they were so intrigued by it that he actually had the guts to come to housing and ask these questions. He became a hang-around for years, and he learned about the inner linings of housing. And it's so interesting, and it really helped me in my career, because you learn in this book that how housing is really, it's such a community. And they have their own barbershops, they have their own network, they have their own banking network where they really rely and help each other. And so it's so interesting to learn that. And what I'll prove to you about community is not about a building. Community is about people. So towards the end of this book, they knocked down some of these housing developments, some of the largest developments in the entire country. And they started to displace families, and they were putting them around different parts of the country. And later on, years later, he finds some of these families. And what's quite interesting is that they had an opportunity for a better life in different places. They actually were family members that found each other, and they went to the same area to live near each other because it was the sense of community. So community is not a building. Community is not a location. Community is about people. And that's what I learned working in housing. You have to know the people to be a part of the community. You don't have to live there. You don't have to have your head on the pillow. We hear that sometimes. Oh, you guys, cops, you're not part of this community. You are, because you're part of those people.
Yes. Thank you for saying that, because I remember a conversation I had with Tony Racanella, who was one of the early guys that ran SRG years ago. He's retired now. He finished up as an inspector. And when he was on the show, he said the same thing a couple years ago, which is, if I'm, and generally speaking, as a police officer, if I'm coming here and spending a tour here, sometimes a double tour here, why am I here? It's not just for the paycheck. Obviously, yeah, I'm working. I'm trying to put food on the table for my family, trying to support myself. But it's because I have a vested interest in making sure this community is good, and making sure that it's thriving, and making sure that it's not being run down. So if you're willing, and it doesn't matter where you're coming from, Rockland County, Long Island, if anything, that adds to the argument that cops are part of the community. Because especially with New York traffic and having to sit in it, having to drive 2 hours to work, having to drive and sit in Long Island traffic or Westchester County or Rockland County traffic just to get to work, if they're willing to do that, believe me, they care about the community.
Oh, you couldn't be more accurate on that. I mean, an average workday without overtime is close to 9 hours. So with the amount of time that you commute to work, because now once you're commuting to work, your mind is set on what your day is going to be like, and you should be at least thinking about work to prepare yourself, right? And also, if you're spending 2 hours to get home without overtime, we could say arguably there you have about a 12-hour to 13-hour day. with the community. So most of your day is dedicated to your work. So you do become part of that community. And if you're doing intrusive police work and you're a good cop out there, you're going to spend a lot more time because you're going to be making arrests. You're going to be actively engaged. You're going to spend predominantly a majority of your life while you're in your career at your police precinct, at your housing development, in transit. You will be a part of that community.
Hmm.
Absolutely, hands down.
Hmm. And even the guys in ESU, they patrol. Unless you're in a specialized unit where you're strictly at that office, like the bomb squad or other units of the NYPD that don't go out and patrol as much, only select calls when they're called upon. Even guys in the ESU, same thing. They're out in the REP, they're out in these communities. So, listen, again, you couldn't be more accurate in that assessment. Now, you had anti-crime as a sergeant, which is interesting because we see the impact anti-crime had back in the day, the old street crime before they got disbanded in 2002. Same thing, which that is, if you want to look at the pinnacle of plainclothes policing, what it really is and what it should be, look at that unit and look at the impact they were making up until a few years ago when they unfortunately got dramatically reduced. So for you being a boss in a unit like that, where you got to blend in, you're not operating undercover, but you're still operating in a sense where you have to be stealth, and you got more target assignments specifically as it revolves around taking guns off the street. What was it like to not only be a part of that, but like I said, be a boss in a great unit like that?
Well, first of all, it was an honor because, so for one, I got promoted with 5 years in the police department. As soon as you get promoted, you can get promoted. I was afforded that opportunity. So that was an honor in itself. And just on top of that, I mean, the cherry on top of that was within a few months, I was fortunate enough that the anti crime sergeant in the East Village in PSA 4 at the time was retiring himself. So that door had opened for me. And it wasn't something I had thought of. I thought, wow, I'm a little green on this job. Even with my military background, I'm still inexperienced. At least I always consider myself inexperienced because I'm always ambitious and I want to get to that next step. And the members of the anti-crime team at that time in the East Village had a substantial amount of time on the job. They were all veterans. They were highly skilled. And they actually advocated and said they wanted me to become the anti-crime sergeant. So I was blown away. I said, wow, I was excited to have this opportunity, but at the same time, I was shocked. But, I always feel that you jump 2 feet in, you take that challenge, and without risk, there's no reward. So I took that risk. I figured this could crash and burn, or, I could do great. So fortunately, it worked out. I worked with some fantastic men and women that the police department has to offer. And I brought my insight, but at the same time, with their experience, they guided me to bliss. And I learned so much more from them than they did from me. We went out, and I really started to harbor and garner those observation skills that you need to become a cop. Once you're in plain clothes, your skills get heightened to a different level. For one, just a safety factor that now you're not in uniform, you lose that sense of presence a bit. So if you're in a potential altercation, you have to embody those skills and characteristics and traits to have a good presence. Because obviously we could handle ourselves. We were big burly men as a group and trained, but we don't want to engage to an altercation every day. Again, I said we work in housing. We're working in everyone's backyard. We need most of the people and majority of them to be our alliance, not our enemy. We want the potential subjects and perpetrators to be our foes and to bring them into custody. So I learned observation skills, the behavioral indicators to find those that are in possession of legal firearms. And in addition to that, as the anti-crime sergeant of getting illegal firearms, we did SNU operations, which stood at the time for Street Narcotics Enforcement Unit operations, where we had surveillance vans. It was such a high level of drug crime in the East Village that we were also doing that. So we were kind of hybrid, and we made some great drug arrests, and we made some fantastic firearm arrests. And it was an amazing group of guys, and most of them were retired way before I retired. And I thank them for really guiding me and teaching me the way.
I love what you said earlier. They guided me to bliss. I don't think I've ever heard that before, but that's a great way to put it because somebody told me this. This was Chief Jay Jonas when I was doing an FDNY interview where he said, as a boss, you work for the men. Listen, you are a boss in some senses. You do have to guide them in some senses, but they don't work for you as much as you work for them. So A boss that recognizes that is going to have a great rapport with his colleagues, or with her colleagues or subordinates, and is going to have a great time. And you sure did have a great time, because that's real police work. That's what people don't see. It's not Starsky and Hutch. It's not Law and Order, although that's great. It's grunt work like that on the street. It's often thankless. And unfortunately, we don't recognize it until a police officer gets hurt or killed in line of duty.
Well, absolutely. The fun, the excitement that you have in the police department is the camaraderie and the morale, and it's the pranks, it's the jokes. That's how you get each other going. And John and I were talking about this the other day. John McCarry from the other half of the podcast for the Finest Unfiltered. We were talking about this the other day, that the key to masculinity is team bonding and camaraderie. When you're in the gym together and you're working out, you push each other, and it really builds that testosterone, builds that spirit to go out there and do the job. And you would have the pranks, and that's the fun part of the job, because what you learn fast, especially doing anti-crime, and especially as an anti-crime sergeant, if you're doing your job correctly, you're actually bored. And that's what people don't understand. They have this ideology that the anti-crime cops in plainclothes are just throwing people up against the wall all day. And that's completely in opposition of what a skilled anti-crime team actually does. A majority of the day is boredom, sitting in spots, doing surveillance. I would have sometimes, let's say we had a robbery pattern. I remember I had some of my cops in winter clothes. I mean, you could only see their eyes a little bit because it's so cold out, and they would be on a rooftop for hours doing surveillance. And we were casing for two things. Half my team, if we had a pattern, was casing for the potential subjects, and the other half would be casing for the potential victims. And that we put together to actually find the perpetrators and the adversaries of these patterns. And it was extremely skillful, and it was something that I learned from them, and I put my own spin on it. And together, we were a fantastic team, and we worked well together because we built relationships. We relied on each other, and I thank them for that. And it was an amazing time.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because you saw Bill Ryan's ad earlier. He was a street crime guy before he ended up in the detective bureau. And he was saying the same thing. That's what they would do. You would sit in those spots. And unless it's something urgent, like a 1013, an officer down, you're not answering radio runs. If it's conventional stuff that a sector car can handle, that's what people don't realize about anti-crime or street crime back in the day. They don't answer radio runs unless it's something, like I said, urgent of that nature. You're waiting. You spot behavior that's off. Somebody's walking with the bulge in their waist. 9 times out of 10 what that is. And it's not a deck of cards that's underneath their shirt. It's more times often than not a firearm. So that's the thing, that not only is it precision policing, I'll coin a term tonight, it's patience policing. Because to sit there for hours and hours, sometimes nothing happens, and that's good. It means everybody in the neighborhood's on their best behavior. But sometimes after 4 or 5 hours, you might be getting restless, and boom, that's when something happens. And boom, that's when you notice something. And boom, that's when you make a good arrest.
You find out extremely quick, especially when you're an anti-crime sergeant, part of an anti-crime team. You have to have a perspicacious mindset, right? You have to have insight to understand your nomenclature. When I say nomenclature, is that you have to understand where you work, the demographics, the geography of it. So where you work, it's important that you form a baseline of what that area should look like. And that's what I said earlier. Policing is not a one-size-fits-all. You have to know if you're working in Midtown, if you work in the South Bronx, if you work in the 112 precinct, you have to know your area, what it looks like when it's at a societal norm, when it's at a norm for that particular area. And that's what I say is the baseline. You have to understand what your baseline is. And when you're out there doing surveillance and you're working for your team, you're looking for those indicators that do not fit the baseline, and they emerge. And those are the things that you start to harp in on. And those are the skills that you learn as a cop. And you see things that others don't see.
Right. Well, it's that trained eye, like you said. And then you have that enhanced background, of course, from your time in the military. We're talking with Lieutenant Special Assignment Eric Dim here on the Mike the Raven podcast. He is one half of the New York's Finest and Retired and Unfiltered podcast with John McCarry. They're available on YouTube. I put the links in the description if you want to find their show. It's available on audio as well for those of you that listen to podcast on audio. Now comes a time where you end up making lieutenant. And I like this transition because it's a lot of time you had as a sergeant. So you have time to learn how to be a boss. You have time to hone your skill set that way to where the transition to lieutenant, although not completely a walk in the park, because there's still some more things to learn, it's easier because now, hey, been there, done that. I'm a boss. I know what the boss level is like. Just the different facets within is what I have to learn as I ascend in the ranks. But at least that transition that you had in 2009 is not the same one you're having now.
So it's a great opportunity and it's a great transition, but it's a complete different transition from cop to sergeant and sergeant to lieutenant. But yet it's still a transition that you have to learn and understand. From cop to sergeant, you're one of the men you're a troop member. But once you become a sergeant, you're a frontline boss. But I don't even like the word boss or supervisor. I believe you should be a mentor and a leader. Anyone can be a boss, anyone can be a supervisor, but not everyone can be a leader. And now you're leading a small unit or a small team, and really transitioning. I used to say this before, and I still believe this. It takes a good 3 years to you really make that transition from cop to sergeant to really understand as a leader how your role plays out different, because you're not a member of that team, you are leading that team. So it does take about a year till you understand that there is a separation, and it takes a good 3 years till you really make that transition. Now, when it comes from sergeant to lieutenant, that's another transition that you make, because yes, you're in a leadership position. Sergeant to lieutenant's the same, but now you're leading other leaders, and there's a key to be an effective lieutenant, and that's allowing your sergeant to be a leader, not overstepping them, not overshadowing them, letting them do their job, at the same time being there to be a mentor, to train them, and to guide the unit as a whole together, responsible of building the entire camaraderie. Because now, as a lieutenant, eventually I transitioned to a special operations lieutenant. So I didn't just have one team, I had several teams. So now I'm supervising several sergeants. So my job was to build a relationship and to make that all those teams, make them one. That was my ultimate goal, is that there's not a separation where there's different teams, but to make them feel like they're one giant family. And I was a member, and for me, I was the head of that family.
Yeah, of course. Of course. And you bringing that up made me think of my job. I work as a media specialist for a fire department here in Connecticut, and I see that. And I was having this conversation with somebody the other day where we truly have a great crop of fire officers for that reason. We got 4 captains right now, and each of them, same thing. They let their lieutenants be lieutenants. When it's time to take command of a scene, when it's time to step in and do certain things that need to be done as a captain should, they do that, but they don't do it at the expense of their lieutenants, because, and I think this is something that kind of unfortunately contaminates, I should say, a lot of organizations. Somebody makes boss, somebody has a title, they have to let you know that they're the boss. It's an ego thing that so many have. They have to let you know who's in charge. And unfortunately, it reeks of insecurity, and gradually it deteriorates morale. The good bosses, they know they have the authority. They don't always exercise it when they don't need to. That discretion, I feel, is an underrated part of being a boss. And as you said that, I also thought about Chief Esposito, who we just lost to 9/11 cancer. That's what he understood. And, and all the tributes that have come out about him since his passing a couple nights ago at the age of 73 have echoed pretty much that sentiment. He was a leader who understood where he was secure in who he was, and as a result was not only able to lead the troops, but other leaders. And you don't see too many guys like that anymore.
Well, first of all, I don't know if we'll ever see someone like that again, especially with the way the police department is headed, the direction and the path that the police department is moving at, especially at this rate. So, of course, I would like to honor Chief Esposito. I'd like to say God bless to him, God bless to his surviving family, and Godspeed. It's an honor that I was working in the police department when he was chief of the department. As chief of the department, one of the characteristics that I extremely reflected upon and I admired is something that he embodied that I learned in the Marine Corps. And this is something that was met with resistance and reluctance from the police department, especially as Chief Esposito at the time started to transition at the police department. And when I say that is, I was met with resistance because I was at the front with my men. And that's what Chief Esposito did. He was at the front. And what I learned in the Marine Corps is leaders lead from the front, not from the rear. And that's the part that the supervisors, the bosses that I had towards the end of my career, especially as I started to accumulate attention from the Civilian Complaint Review Board, well, I was told, well, you need to stay in the rear. Let the men do their job. And what I watch sometimes, I like to correlate this. I watch what's going on right now with these anarchists and these riots that we have day in and day out. And I see these chiefs smack in the middle of a situation. And that's where I say, that's where they should hone on and say, that's improper leadership. You should not be in the middle where you can't see everything. And you should not be in the rear where you're not assisting and you're not guiding your men. You need to be at the front. And that's something I learned in the Marine Corps. And that's what my bosses towards the end of my career did not understand. You should be at the front where you can see everything and you're leading the charge. Do not ask your men and women to do something you will not do. But at the same token, don't be in the middle where you're encompassed and that, God forbid, you get hurt. You're now useless and someone else has to step in your place. So leadership is so valuable. And I honor Chief Esposito because he embodied that trait, which was something that we have lost. And we don't see it in the police department as we speak.
Yeah. I mean, he held that post for 13 years. Before him, Joe Dunn, another great leader, who was also first deputy commissioner, and Lou Animone before him, another great leader who really helped the police department. So that stretch where you had guys like that at the helm, that was a good time. That was a good time. And unfortunately, it's long gone. Now, back to your career. You were in the Bronx. Now, that's what I like about your career. It was varied. You had Staten Island, you had the East Village for a little bit. Now you have the Bronx. And again, new borough, but same mission. And you talked about some of the relationships you had with your sergeants. You talked about the duties that were there. As lieutenant, you got to oversee, I should say, several operations. From that time in your career, what are some of the key operations that most stick out that you were proudest of in the work that your cops did?
Oh, absolutely. I was surrounded by the finest men and women that the police department has to offer. Again, I was honored. I had the opportunity. I was in PSA 4, which is Police Service Area 4 in the East Village. And I had an opportunity to stay in Manhattan. I was offered different precincts in Manhattan. I was even offered the detective squad in numerous different precincts. And I had turned it down because an opportunity came up to work as a special operations lieutenant in PSA 7, which is the South Bronx. And I loved doing anti-crime work, that plainclothes type work. And I loved working in housing. So I said, sure enough. And who doesn't want to be close to Yankee Stadium? So I was completely excited by it, right? So sure enough, South Bronx, here we come. I was super excited. And as a special operations lieutenant, I oversaw anti-crime teams. At the time, we had teams called conditions where they address quality of life and different conditions that affect that particular precinct that you work in. And I was innovative in I started what was called crew suppression teams. Because if the public doesn't know this, or members of the police department, Police Service Area 7 at that time, which I'm sure it's only been about a year and a half since I've been retired, probably the same, was the second highest in the entire city for the amount of crews or gangs that PSA 7 had. So I figured, what better to address it than to start what was called the crew suppression team. So I had young men and women that were extremely impressionable, which I thought they weren't ready for anti-crime yet, because you need specific tools and skills to do anti-crime, and also a certain level of maturity, not an age, but a level of maturity of understanding how the police department works, and also the discipline to not to chase the radio, as you were saying earlier, when you're doing surveillance. So it was a great opportunity to get these men and women that were full of fire, and they had that enthusiasm that they wanted to be cops, to learn gang-facilitated crimes. And so they went out there as a team, and they went out there doing intrusive police work. And they made them read case law and understand police work. And eventually, as they grew, I started to transition them into anti-crime teams. So it was almost like farming them out. If you're taking guys from AAA ball to major leagues, that's how I ran it. And I had the most amazing men and women that were part of anti-crime, crime suppression teams, condition teams. And what's also interesting, it was hybrid. I oversaw community affairs. I oversaw the Explorer unit, the PSA 7 Explorer unit. I really took extreme amount of pride, and I was so involved in it. I volunteered my time. I taught a boxing program. I went to some of these kids' Sweet 16s. I went out playing basketball with them. I mentored them. I tutored them. These kids really became part of my life. And to this day, in my retirement, I still talk to some of these kids as they're in college, and some of them became cops, some are in the military.
Wow. Yeah, no, and I love that program so much. Unfortunately, people look at Explorer units with a negative connotation because of some negative headlines that, bad people have unfortunately sullied the reputation of. But then this is the majority, right? These are the programs. FD has them, PT has them, where it starts to love, and people get to not only learn about the profession but the people behind it, and it kickstarts their interest, and eventually they're able to come onto the job. And it's a beautiful thing, and I'm glad that they're still around. And, it's interesting policing in an area near Yankee Stadium because any landmark you're near, certainly this is true in Queens for any of the cops that are on patrol around Citi Field or back in the day, Shea Stadium, is you want the landmark to not have a negative reputation either. People aren't going to want to come to the Bronx or come to not only the Yankee Stadium, but to the restaurants and shops around there if it's not safe. I remember back in the mid 90s, before they built the new one, George Steinbrenner was talking with Mayor Giuliani about potentially moving the Yankees out of the Bronx. This is when they were talking about building a stadium over on the west side. And what helped the argument was the NYPD was doing great work in that area to make sure crime stayed down. And as a result, the Yankees still to this day are in the Bronx. Now, this was something that you made headlines for, and I wanted to ask you about because it's a great thing. One sees a lot of terrible things as a police officer, but for as many bad things as you see, you get to do a lot of great things and experience a lot of great things as well. This was a situation that started out really bad, but ended really well. And I'm talking about a young boy who'd been shot. I believe he was 9 years old. And you played a huge hand in making sure that that boy lived to see another day. So why don't you tell that story?
But this kid was extremely brave. I haven't spoken to him in a while. I was staying in touch, and I kind of lost touch. He was actually 5 years old. It was a
Oh,
great
younger.
story. 5 years old, and this kid was so brave, and he barely even cried when he had his gunshot wound, and he was bleeding from his arm. And I mean, and just the amount of bravery that this kid had, I was just shocked. To this day, I just have nothing but admiration. And I'm sure this kid he probably will become something big. You just can see it in him. So sure enough, I just happened to be lucky to be the one to respond that day. I was on my way to work. I was pulling to the parking lot. I didn't even have a gun on me. It was October of 2018. It wasn't completely winter yet. It was fall. So I was just mildly dressed. I had a t-shirt and pants on. I didn't even have a gun on me. I was walking into the back of the precinct. That's where we parked our cars. And sure enough, rushing out the door comes my commanding officer, great guy, and he throws me a set of keys and says, "We gotta go, we gotta go." I'm sure he didn't know I didn't sign in. I was in plain clothes. It was normal being a special operations lieutenant. I wasn't gonna say, "Oh, I don't have my gun, I don't have my equipment." I said, "Let's go." So sure enough, we got into the car and we drove to a housing development on Webster Avenue. And I'll never forget, we got the call and he said, "A kid is shot, a kid is shot." So that was the information that we had. So sure enough, we got out of the car, we went to the housing development, we got to the building, we ran upstairs, and we got to the sixth floor. And at the top of the sixth floor, there was a man laying on the ground, bleeding profusely. The blood was just fire engine red. And every cop that's watching this, especially anyone in the nation knows when you see that, you know that the person already met their demise. And within a couple of feet, I saw two young rookies helping this young boy. And I ran over to see what was going on. And they were trying to see if they had a tourniquet. And he was bleeding from his arm. 5 years old, he was shot. He was bleeding profusely. And I didn't have any equipment. So I took my trouser belt off and I made a makeshift tourniquet as long as it would last on his arm. And it did assist in the bleeding. And some of the cops ran upstairs. And one of the cops, Officer Olson, I handed him this 5-year-old boy, Omar Million. He took him, ran outside. They took him to the hospital. And the kid was just, his demeanor was amazing, the way he handled himself. And unfortunately, he and his father were together when they were shot. His father met his demise. But this kid is doing great today. He's doing fantastic. I had responded to the hospital a couple of days later where we went with some gifts and really got to meet this kid. It was an honor. And I do believe, I'm not very much religious. I'm starting to understand religion more, but I'm more spiritual. I do believe that I was meant to meet this kid and just to see his bravery. It really solidified why we do what we do. And it was an honor to be the one to be at that call that day.
Thanks for telling that story. Like I said, it's a great story. Imagine being 5 years old. You don't even know what's what yet. You don't have a care in the world. You're innocent at that age. And that innocence was deprived in one terrifying instance. And he lost his father in that attack too. And it's tragic all around what happens sometimes on these streets and the callousness of some people. But where you see the worst of humanity, you also see the best, right? And that's what was displayed that day. You saw the worst, and whoever it was that barbarically walked up and murdered this poor kid's father and shot him in the process as well. But you saw the best in the responding officers like yourself go up there, help this kid, and again, make sure that he was doing well under those circumstances. So great job. Job well done, not only to you, but to all the officers that responded to that. So thank you for telling that story.
Oh, absolutely. So the irony to this story. So simultaneously, as I responded to this call, within days, my teams and we started to do our own investigation to find the perpetrators, the adversaries, or any subjects, any persons of interest that were involved in this case. And it led to several search warrants and several arrests, which also included a proclamation from the time the borough president, and also included awards for the communities. I received lieutenant leader of the finest, all kinds of awards, which honestly, I don't care about these awards that don't define me, but it's an honor to be rewarded by the community. You get to meet these people in a different environment, a controlled environment where they have an opportunity to thank them. They thank you and you thank them. And the reason why I say I don't care about the awards, but it was an honor is because this is an opportunity where I actually get to meet community people and talk to them in a different setting. Because especially doing anti-crime as a sergeant and as a special operations lieutenant, I'm out there seeking the most violent perpetrators that New York City has to offer. So I'm not engaging with the kind people of the community at this time. So it was a breath of fresh air. And so simultaneously, as I'm getting these awards from the police department, from the unions, from newspapers, from the community, this is when the attack of the overzealous Civilian Complaint Review Board started to embark. As the tide started to really change and we started to see this woke movement penetrate the police department, this is where my career started to take a change.
Take a swig of water real quick.
Absolutely.
Talking with Lieutenant Special Assignment Eric Dim here on the Mike the Maven podcast. This is episode 292. And I have a running joke here. One of the guys that tunes into the show consistently is Joe Maliga. He's a retired correctional officer. And anytime I get an FD or a PD guest on, he asks this question, which is, did you ever deliver a baby?
Oh, that's a great question. I was actually always hoping that I would be a part of that. I've seen so many guys to be a part of that. I mean, it just thought it was so amazing just to help a woman, who doesn't make it to the hospital and be a part of that to deliver a baby. Unfortunately, no, I never did. I appreciate it. But I've had some of my cops that were close to me that were a part of it. And it's something I wish I was a part of because I saw their faces and the way they described it. I mean, I think for some of them, it's really changed their lives. Just hearing about it was a life changer for me. But no, it's a great question.
Okay. Well, like I said, I always like to ask. Sometimes guys say yes, and there's a story behind it that we always like hearing. And hi to David Burns. He's tuning in tonight via LinkedIn. And Mike Alcazar, who I think was on your show, says hello. He's like, I never worked with Eric, but I could tell he's an awesome boss. And Mike, since you're watching tonight on LinkedIn, send me a timeline of your career to my email. It's in the contact section of my LinkedIn, and let's try to get you on the show as well in short order because I know you had a great career as well. And you touched on something to where, like you said, things were changing in 2017, 2018. It feels like we were in the last era of, the good times to be a police officer because 2018, the murder rate in New York City was 289. Now, still, one life lost is one too many. Obviously, we're not, diminishing the losses of these lives. But from 1990, when there was over 2,000 murders in New York City to just 289 in 2018 is a massive improvement. That's because of the work the NYPD was doing. You had a crazy 2020, as I think every New York City police officer had in 2020. You've talked about that at length on the Finest Unfiltered. And then came your retirement in 2022, but you brought up an interesting point now where if you're going to evaluate how something went, and that's something being a policing encounter, good or bad, you have to have the context. And it seems now the thing that hurt you late in your career undeservedly, and the thing that's hurting a few other guys and gals out in the street now, is the loss of that context. And then, they get a complaint. It might not be what it's presented as, because 9 times out of 10, if you're an active cop, and this is what people don't understand, you're going to get complaints. And it's not complaints from people that you quote unquote brutalize. It's not that. 9 times out of 10, are there legit complaints out there? Yeah, of course. Listen, I'm not saying there's no such thing as a legit complaint, but 9 times out of 10, it's a bad guy or his significant other filing a complaint because they're mad they're getting arrested. It's just the thing to be vindictive and get back at the cop that's booking them. It's not really anything legit.
Well, I don't shy away from these complaints. Obviously, most people that watch the podcast, they know that I use a handle for Twitter and Instagram as Most Complaint Cop. That's how my name was smeared in the paper. So I wear it as a moniker. Yeah. And to prove that it's just complete lie, almost like what Trump says, fake news. It's fake news. Am I the most complaint cop on paper? Yes. But exactly what you just said. Let's look at the context. If you look at my career, every one of my complaints stemmed from an arrest situation. Every one of these complaints comes from the most violent perpetrators in New York City. These are perpetrators in possession of illegal firearms, known gang members, persons that have a repeated recidivist offender record of fighting with the police. And if they fight with the police, that means they fight with the public. And if you look at my career, if you look from when I embarked in my career from January of 2004 up till about 2018, before this woke movement started to tie in with the Civilian Complaint Review Board, I did get complaints, and it's a byproduct of doing intrusive police work. But they were sporadic. I got a complaint I think I had one in 2005, one in 2007, one in 2009, two in 2010. And then there was about a 3-year span where I didn't have any. Then I get one again. But then when 2018 hits, you could just see a complete 180, a seismic shift of how the Civilian Complaint Review Board targeted my actual record. As they started to get more funding, the laws started to change, and the Civilian Complaint Review Board was more empowered. And politics penetrated the Civilian Complaint Review Board, and their bias and disdain towards policing really started to come out. And you could see as the complaints came up from 2018 to the last complaint I received in June 4th of 2020, which stemmed from the riots of George Floyd. That is the majority, probably 75 to 80% of my complaints. And they're all from perpetrators. And I think the last time I tallied up, I think it was 93% are still in custody. So just to give an understanding to the public of the context and the nomenclature of these particular complaints.
I remember listening to the Finest Unfiltered. Now, this is funny, where you told the story where a gentleman, and you're in plain view of, this is at the front of the precinct where everyone can see you. You're patting a guy down, and he makes a complaint that you stuck your finger up his derriere, which of course did not happen. And then, they investigate the complaint. Obviously, everyone can see from the footage in the precinct cameras, and obviously the body-worn camera too, that didn't occur. You put the guy in the cell, you treated him like a gentleman. And I think, did they still say substantiated? And I'm like, huh?
So this was an interesting case. So I just wanted people to understand.
Right.
So it was a person of interest, a subject that we had apprehended on the street in the confines of PSA 7 in the 4-0 precinct and housing. At the time, we had significant amount of robbery patterns. We had several robbery patterns that were independent, differently from each other, but they were affecting the community, along with a rash of shootings. And we had this particular subject. And at the time, he was only in possession of marijuana, which is not something that we arrest, especially in anti-crime. And at the time, it was illegal. And I'm not a big advocate. I'm not against marijuana at all. But it was a tool. It was a pretextual tool for a stop where I could detain someone and to do intrusive police work, especially in this particular subject. So this particular subject we apprehended because the mannerisms were not accurate, and they didn't line up with just being in possession of a small quantity of marijuana. But my spotty senses went up, the observation skills, the behavioral indicators that I understood what I saw. I knew there was more than what meets the eye. So I made the determination to make the apprehension. As soon as we made the apprehension, this particular person subject just went insane. And I knew we got something here. It didn't match up with being in possession with a small quantity of marijuana. If anything, we could give discretion or a small summons. And most people are familiar, especially if at 2 in the morning, if you're in the confines of PSA 7 or in the 4-0 precinct and you're walking around by yourself, you're up to no good. Let's just be honest, especially out in the cold with these robbery patterns and these shootings going on. If you're outside in that manner, you're up to no good. I would say if you're walking from A to B, that's understandable. But if you're in the same spot for 30 seconds, you're up to no good. And I know that from my experience. So once we started to just give questions about pedigree, name, information, it was lie after lie after lie. So sure enough, once we brought this adversary into the cells, he just went completely nuts and wasn't allowing my officers to do an actual search. Sure enough, we learned his information at that time, and we learned he was the suspect, and we had probable cause to make an arrest for a robbery. He committed a robbery at the confines of the 4-3 precinct in the Castle Hill houses. So I said, okay, there might be a nexus here between this particular person subject to the robbery pattern that we had. Sure enough, he wouldn't allow my officers to do a search. We had to use some force, minimal amount of force, to get him in handcuffs to do a proper search. And the allegation was that I stuck my finger up his rear, which was complete false. And the camera did not reflect that either. And just to show the disdain for police from the Civilian Complaint Review Board, the Civilian Complaint Review Board, their attorney's response at the trial was that it was inferred. They couldn't see it on the camera, but it's inferred that I put my finger there. And what's oddly enough, when I heard his complaint, it was so matter of fact. Yeah, the cop stuck his finger in my rear, and then they didn't stop and start to continue. I mean, that's a big deal. They just went on to the next question. So sure enough, took it to administrative trial. I was found not guilty. But when you look at the 50A, it still says substantiated. And if you didn't look any further, because it will not reflect it on the 50A, you would think that I stuck my finger in his rear.
Yeah. Yeah, when you told me that story. I'm sorry. When I heard it on the podcast, it was just hilarious because of the absurdity of it, and the dangerous thing with 50A is, and I remember I saw this. I was doing research for an ESU interview I was getting ready to do, and I was going to ask the ESU officer in particular about some of his colleagues who gave their lives on 9/11 from, I think, 2 Truck. So I typed in John DeLera. Now, anybody that worked with John DeLera, who's one of the 14 officers from ESU that perished that day, knows he was a great guy and was a great cop. So I type in his name to see if I could find some additional anecdotes from my research. He's on 50A. And I'm like, what's a fallen officer who died in the line of duty, especially on a day like that, doing up on 50A? Why? What's the reason? What's the point? That alone, that really disturbed me.
Well, that's been our argument, John and I, on the podcast, is that 50A is not there for transparency as they want people to believe. That's the lie. That's the false perception. They want people to believe that it's about transparency. Because I can go on this even further. We have cops there from the 70s that has their 50A. And even now in retirement, I'm close to 18 months of retirement. Why is my 50A reflective? Why is that available to the public at this point where I'm not employed by the police department anymore? And why is there no context to understand these complaints, that they're from adversaries, they're from arrestees? Most of them are still in custody. And what's interesting about the 50A is that the Civilian Complaint Review Board has their own database. So the public, anyone, Mike, if you have an opportunity, you can go onto the Civilian Complaint Review Board database and you go into MOS lookup. MOS stands for Member of the Service. And there are different captions. And you can find any precinct, any specialized unit in the entire city. I can get you a roster right now of everyone. Just think about how dangerous this 50A is to the police officers. This is a target on the police officer's back. That's what the Civilian Complaint Review Board did here. If they put a target on the cop's back, you can go to any precinct, type in any name. There's different ways to find someone, and I can get you an entire roster of a precinct, and it will show their civilian complaint review, their civilian complaints. Even the cops that never received the complaint, you can get their information. To me, that is scary. That's dangerous. It's not about transparency. That's to put a target on the cops' back to inhibit them and disable them from doing police work.
And there's also the danger too of, let's say there's a bad guy out there that's really ticked off. He got collared, when he wants to get revenge and he wants to track down that officer. What happens if he finds that officer and harms that officer or harms the officer's family? That's the thing too, that, you're entitled, whatever job you have, to some degree of privacy. And that privacy is gone now, unfortunately. And as QC Beast points out in the chat, they have the list of several officers on 50A who've died in the line of duty, not just on 9/11, but any other officers who've been killed across the years. I remember I was doing research on somebody else, and Patrick Rafferty, who got killed the same year you came on the job. That's the Rafferty Parker shooting from September of 2004. Those two gentlemen are up there. I'm like, again, why? Especially them, especially them. If there was any officers who you would want to show some courtesy to, I believe it would be them that died in the line of duty, or any officer that's died in the line of duty. Now, getting to the Retired and Finest and Unfiltered podcast, and we'll touch on this and get to the rapid fire. The podcast has been great. It's shed a lot of light on a lot of different topics. It's offered unique perspectives from not just yourself, but your guests too, and certainly John. So in starting that, what's been interesting is, and I see this just as a bystander watching you guys on social media as I do, and following you guys on social media as I do, not only is there the upper echelon of the NYPD that indirectly has taken shots at you guys, there's members of the service, which I find is particularly unfortunate because you advocate for them a lot. And it seems like a lot of them really don't like what you're saying, and that to me, like I said, is sad, because you're coming at it from such a good place. It's an honest place, but it's ticking a lot of people off. And I guess, I don't know, how would you respond? Like you mentioned earlier, you have a lot of haters. How would you respond, especially to the upper echelon? It seems to have taken such an issue with two guys who, again, are retired. There's a lot of retired guys out there that speak their mind. Why is it that they've taken an issue with you two?
Well, John and I have taken a completely different approach, something that has not been seen before. And it's a kudos to John and myself. It may sound conceited, but it's the truth, because John and I are both self-taught. We're both well-read, and we constantly took pride in knowing the ins and outs of our job when we were part of our careers. And just like the book written by John Maxwell, How Successful People Win, it's by evaluating your losses and picking yourself up and continue moving. So John and I, in a perfect world, we would still be in the New York City Police Department, and we'd probably be working our way to being chiefs. It may sound arrogant, but it's true. We both did well in our exams. We both were leaders, and we were both well respected, and we had a trajectory of moving up in this career. But due to the politics that have penetrated the police department, the weak appointed management that has changed the complete nomenclature of the NYPD, it's the same patch, but it's a different job, forced John and I to take another path. Now, for some point, it's a loss. We both lost our careers. But in the end, we won. And we've taken a different path where we have an opportunity to express our perspective and analysis of what's going on, and telling the truth in a different lens than people normally see. We see different organizations, and they talk about hug a cop, thank a cop. And we believe in that also, but we actually give you specific perspective on an actual scene, an event. And we give our opinion based on anecdotal experience and also fact. So people may not always agree. And the reason why they don't agree, especially the upper echelon, is because the upper echelon that is in place right now is just completely weak and inept. And they cannot fool the media anymore and fool the public, because guess what? When they try it, there's John and Eric to hold them accountable. Well, because we have a complete insight. And we've been called podcast losers, and we've been attacked by different cops in the upper echelon of the job. But that's fine. I don't take it personally. I actually laugh at it. And it just shows their weak egos, which is something that needs to be removed from leadership. You need to emotionally detach yourselves. And it shows how inadequate they are. Because John and I are both out of state, and we're speaking on social media. It's such a powerful weapon to speak the truth and hold them accountable, because we expect a better NYPD. We expect a Chief Esposito, someone like that, to lead the police department. And if the police department was led properly, we would be in a much better condition in the city, even with the legislation that has been enacted. Yes, the police department has been handicapped by woke legislation, but the police department still has the ability to do a great effort. There's a lot that can be done. We talk about that on the podcast as we speak. With the support, if the unions and the police department actually supported their men and women. But instead of focusing on cop watching and these other terrorist organizations, the focus has been on John and I. Why? Because what we are saying is correct. All they have done is just legitimize our podcast even more. And for that, I don't call them haters. I call them fans. So thank you very much to Kaz Daughtry and John Schell and Jeffrey Madry, who are the heads of the New York City Police Department, also the mayor, Eric Adams. They watch our podcast every day. Thank you for being a fan.
As far as the politics of it, one thing I would say about the podcast is I'm not a political guy. Like you follow the show, you know it's not a political show. I don't really care. I don't take sides. It's more so just a retrospective on someone's career. But even if you're not that kind of a person, I would suggest you listen to the Finest Unfiltered just because it's an educational thing as well. You learn a lot. There's certain aspects of the NYPD I didn't know in terms of how it operated, good and bad, until I started listening to the program. I'm like, oh, okay, that's why they do certain things. Oh, that's how that works. So it's very educational as well. And one of the episodes I really liked, because I was curious about this, was the pursuit policy. In New York City, it's very, it's not like LA where there's a pursuit every 30 seconds. On the freeway out there, the LAPD and California Highway Patrol has a blast with that. New York City is very condensed, very condensed. You know, everybody's on top of each other. So it's kind of difficult to have pursuits that way. And cops, unfortunately, have been killed. I think about John Kelly back in 2000, who got killed in a vehicle pursuit on Staten Island, lost control of his car and went into a pole. And Nick DeMutis, same thing in 1994. So yeah, these are, and that alone, I thought, well, wouldn't it make sense to pursue somebody who just committed a robbery? But when you guys explained, no, this is why it's dangerous, and no, this is why in most situations you shouldn't pursue, I'm like, okay, that makes sense. So even if you're not somebody that's into the other facets of what John and Eric are talking about, like I said, from an educational standpoint alone, the podcast is worth listening to because you're going to learn a lot, and I sure have. So thanks for what you guys are doing week in and week out, because I enjoy it. Like I said, I really do learn a lot.
Well, John and I have been at the forefront. When John and I got together, first, John was the founder of the actual New York's Finest Unfiltered podcast. We started interviewing people, started to speak out and fight this ridiculous mandate. And I had reached out to John months before I retired. And at that point, I was being silenced by the union, silenced by the job. I did not get an opportunity to oppose, to have a communication with the newspapers, the newspaper outlets, to explain my side of the story about being the most complained cop. So ultimately, what the police department and the unions wanted was for me to be silenced and just go away. And I was told repeatedly, you're going to get a nice pension. Don't worry about it. Just enjoy your life. And what they're saying, I got the subliminal messages, was just disappear and go away. So sure enough, I'm walking around the precinct. I keep hearing about this guy, Johnny Mac. Hey, there's this guy, Johnny Mac, talking. I'm like, Johnny Mac, who is that? So I looked it up. I wasn't a social media guy. I was never on social media. And I see it's John. John and I had worked together as rookies. I mentored him as a rookie, even though I was a rookie myself. And I called John. I said, John, I contacted him through social media. I said, John, I'm retiring soon. I have an opportunity to stay here, but I'm leaving. And I want to be the catalyst for change for CCRB and this weaponized disciplinary matrix. So we started to converse. And when I retired, John gave me a platform. I had an interview, and I got some of my message out there. And I said to John, you know what? You and I both are extremely versatile when it comes to the police department. And I think we have an it factor that other people don't have. I was thinking about having a consulting company. I said, let's give our perspective and analysis of what's going on right now. We have such knowledge to offer. We were beat down by the job. We had to leave our careers, but this is a new path. And I saw the future, and I still do for us. I do believe we are now a media outlet for law enforcement. Right now, predominantly the New York City Police Department, I do think it will branch out for the country and the entire world. Yeah. So John and I teamed up, and we're under the umbrella. We interview people for the Finest Unfiltered. And we also do what's called the 265 Police Live series, where we give our perspective and analysis. And we talk about recently, like the How Many Stops Act, the bill, how it actually works, how it actually affects policing, what the unions don't tell you until now. I saw a tweet yesterday, which was much better, but what the weak management is not telling, because they're They're about preserving their own careers, not what's good for the men and women. That's what true leaders do. They're self-preserving for their own careers. Why? Because most of them owe each other favors, or they're paving the way for their own offspring. So it's not about public interest and about public safety. It's about their own careers. So John and I teamed up together. The podcast is really growing. It's growing because we're speaking the truth. What we're saying is what goes on in the locker room. I've said to John many times, I'm not worried, and John's not worried either. If we were just having a conversation in the locker room or having a conversation, you can record it. It's the same thing that goes on the podcast. But John Shelf, Kaz Daughtry, the weak, inept leadership, they would be very worried if there was a hidden camera, because what they're saying behind closed doors is completely opposite than how they're bending a knee to the public. And that's where I find fault. It's just complete lies. And they know it, and that's why they have such a disdain for John and I as retired cops out of state. And what's sad is we have advocated for the men and women that have given us opposition, that attacked us. John and I attend a civilian complaint review board meeting on a monthly basis virtually, where we testify and give testimony to combat the bias by the civilian complaint review board, protect these cops' careers, to be the catalyst for change. We have deciphered and actually torn apart the disciplinary matrix, which most cops have not read because it's so convoluted and they don't really understand. And we've broken down and explained how it could be weaponized against them if they're not part of this nepotism in the police department. If you are part of this nepotism, this could be used as a tool to protect you. But if you're not in that circle, if you're Sal Greco, who was attacked for having an alliance with Donald Trump and Roger Stone, it could be used to terminate your career. And we are fighting day in and day out, and we've been met with opposition. And I don't take it personal, because these guys do have the potential. If they were led properly, John and I were leading the guys in the tan pants, they could be fantastic. They show clear potential, but they're being led by weak, egotistical maniacs. And they're being led to potentially jail and losing their own financial freedom, because vehicle pursuits is a dangerous tactic. It was always frowned upon, and I still frown upon it. Yes, have I taken part of some vehicle pursuits? Yes, but I've had an opportunity to reflect on it and say it's not something I want to do, because ultimately it's just not worth it. And there's other ways to skin a cat, and there's other ways to effectively address policing with intrusive police work. And I always talk about in police work where it's important mirroring. If I have a potential adversary who's screaming, and if I scream, it's only going to get worse. I need to lower my tone and to show presence to bring that down. So if someone is chasing, if someone is fleeing, and I'm fleeing them, I'm just mirroring them, and we're just creating a fire, and it's only getting worse. We need to slow down. We need to find other ways to get these perpetrators, because all that's going to happen is, God forbid, one of these young cops, their hearts are in the right place, but they're going to run over a 5-year-old and kill them, God forbid. And that's not what the weak management is telling them. They're telling them, hey, kid, you get to wear the nice tan pants. I'll give you days off. They put their arm around them. They make them feel they're a part of something. That's why I don't take it personal, because right now, they're part of something big and important to them. So they don't see the entire picture. And you don't. When I was young on the job, I didn't see the politics of it until years later. But I see it now, and I want to see it for them, and I want them to see it so I can protect them, so that they don't become the most complained cop, or the most complained cop that's in prison.
You know, you mentioned the How Many Stops Act earlier, and again, I'm not taking a side on the issue. I'm simply just finding the humor in it. Like, imagine the log, 11:55 a.m. May I have a banana? 12:01 p.m. How about those Yankees? 12:30 p.m. Boy, it sure is hot out today. Yeah, I was like that. I'm like, when I saw that, I'm like, yeah, that doesn't seem too appealing. But no, like you said, it's a tricky job. There's a lot of juxtapositions with it, and that's the thing that you and John talked about. It could be the old lady crossing the street. It could be the kid that's playing around, and unless it's a situation where you just saw somebody shoot somebody in the face and kill them, or it's a terrorist situation, yeah, it's a little bit too dangerous given how crowded the streets are. It's only going to end poorly, and you get the license plates off these cars anyway. There's cameras everywhere, so you can figure out who they are, where they live, and eventually, hey, knock, knock, hey, it's us again, you know, and then you can get the car that way. So it's a lot better. It's a lot more economical and prudent. You don't want cops getting hurt.
This How Many Stops Act bill that was proposed by Jumaane Williams, enacted by the New York City Council, is dangerous to police work. And ultimately, if it's actually documented properly, it will bring policing to a halt, especially in New York City, a metropolis of 8.5 million people. The key to success of policing is intrusive police work I talk about, and not the Terry versus Ohio stops, right? Terry versus Ohio and People versus DeBoer are two separate cases, but they go hand in hand when it comes to detaining potential adversaries, persons of interest to do your job. But what's so important about People versus DeBoer, and that's what's being attacked from this How Many Stops Act, people have an opportunity to look at it. It's a case from 1976. And it's the first tier that's so important that we understand. And that is the request for information, right? What does that mean? So in order to request information as a police officer, you just need an objective reason to approach. And that's what good cops do the entire day. And that in itself is the intrusive police work. And that's why I say not proactive, because level one is not proactive. We're looking to make an arrest. We're just looking to engage the community because it can lead anywhere. Let's say, for instance, and I used this before, you have someone walk into housing, they have a big bouquet of flowers. It's so confusing already. And they can't find where they're going. Wouldn't it be an objective reason for a police officer to say, hey, buddy, where you headed to? Can I help you? Right? That's a level one encounter, a first level tier encounter from People versus DeBoer that the New York City Council once documented on the rates and different factors of that encounter. And that's a fantastic encounter. Why? That builds an alliance with the community. This young man is walking with a bouquet of flowers. He's lost. He's looking for his date, and you help him. That's a positive interaction, but that has to be documented. That could also be a ploy for someone who using a disguise to commit robberies. And just that level one engagement, if I'm a police officer, say, hey, buddy, where you going? Could scare that person off to leave and not commit that robbery that day. Why? The police officer out here, they're willing to ask me questions. They're inquisitive. Their eyes are on me. This is a major tool that the New York City Council is stripping from the police department. And who are they ultimately stripping it from? From the public, from public safety. They're a danger to the community, not the cops.
And on that note, we can get to the rapid fire. 5 hit run questions for me, 5 hit run answers for me. You could say pass if you want. I'm going to start switching gears a bit from that to first, the funniest call that you ever responded to.
The funniest call. Well, I've been to so many calls, but yes, I'll never forget one time. Sure, my cops and I responded to a call of someone that was running around naked. And of course, when you hear something like that, cops have a great sense of humor. Everyone's running to that call to see what it is. So we get to this house, and this woman, unfortunately, she's induced by different substances, but she's completely nude, and she's laying down on the floor, and she's screaming that Jesus is coming to take her. And she's bleeding, and there's blood everywhere, and she's flopping around. So we're all looking for a wound. We think that she's hurt, and then eventually she takes us to the bathroom to show us her woman's supplies, her tampons and things like that. We realized, it was just the time of the month, and this blood was not a wound, but she was screaming that Jesus come to take her, and unfortunately she was under substances. It's not funny that she was under substances, but here we are, we're looking for a gunshot wound or a stab wound. I mean, we were going crazy to find out, that it really wasn't that serious. But just to show the idea of what police officers see, I mean, you could be responding to a call to help a kid, stop a shooting, or someone that's emotionally disturbed because they're under substances.
Well, there you go. That's something. Second, best advice anyone ever gave you.
The best advice. In Iraq. I'll never forget, I had this captain, and he would say, let me tell you something, kid. And to this day, I say the same thing. Put his arm around me and said, listen, do everything that you could do right now. Jump 2 feet in. He said, don't worry about money. Don't worry about that stuff. When they say, listen, we need someone to go to this location, go to that location, because when it's all said and done, all you're going to have in life is your stories. What are going to be your stories? So that's why I say the same thing to people. If you're in the New York City Police Department, you're in the military, or you're part of a company, or you're Mike Colón, and you're doing a podcast, jump 2 feet in, go as hard as you can. And if you fail, pick yourself up, go back up, do it again. Albert Einstein, Thomas Edison failed 1,000 times to make the light bulb. He said it wasn't 1,000 failures, it was 1,000 steps to success. So jump in, Do everything that you can. Fail, fail, fail. Pick yourself up, because when it's all said and done, all you're going to have is your stories. So don't be afraid to face challenges. Make your stories so you can tell your grandkids about your life and you have something to tell.
I love it. That's awesome. Third, you out of all the boroughs you were assigned to, and even some you might have been detailed to for special events, what was your favorite borough to work in?
Oh, that's really interesting. I believe it or not, I'm actually going to say the Bronx. The Bronx was the was a lot of fun. The food was awesome. The people were great. I mean, you buy Yankee Stadium. It's just such an iconic place, and it's almost like this place it's almost like the unknown. For some people, it's scary. It's like, well, you talk to most people, and that's why I enjoyed working in the Bronx. Talk to most people that are tourists. They go to Brooklyn, they go to Manhattan, they go to Queens, they take the Staten Island ferry. But for most, they don't go to the Bronx. There's this mystique about the Bronx, and unfortunately, this omen in this stereotype of what the Bronx is like. But the Bronx is awesome and has a lot to offer. And I really enjoyed working there.
Yeah, it's a great borough. I agree. I got a lot. I got family down there, so believe me, I echo those sentiments. I'm not just there to see Yankee games. I always love going to East Tremont, see my family whenever I'm down there. Fourth, and you could pick multiple. You don't got to pick one. Favorite bar or restaurant, in New York City?
Oh, that's an easy one. If it's still there, because I haven't been there in a while, Old Homestead, that was my restaurant. If I'm willing to go out and spend some money, I love Old Homestead in the Meatpacking District uh, in Manhattan. You can get a most amazing steak. I love it. Outstanding.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to check it out next time I'm down in the city. And fifth and finally, you kind of alluded to it with the best advice that anyone's ever given you. So I'll tweak the question a bit. Besides that, which was very good, what you mentioned earlier, to any cop coming on the job now, especially in New York City, what advice would you give them? Take out all the other factors that are going on right now, just on a street level. What advice would you give them?
Sure, absolutely. I would tell them to be in complete opposition to the way I embarked on my career. So, to my detriment and also to my success was the traits I learned in the Marine Corps. In the Marine Corps, you learn to obey orders and not to challenge your authority, because that does could cost lives. But unfortunately, what I have learned as my career went on, and policing is different than the military, that the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And what I say by that is I was very silent in my career and I followed orders. Unfortunately, what we're seeing now is we're seeing weak, inept leadership, and that their orders are leading in a bad direction. We see it how they're addressing anarchists, and they address protests differently based on politics. And politics was something that did not penetrate the police department before. And what I say now is there was a study, and I have to find it. I forgot who it was. Only 2% of men and women actually speak out from a group and speak out in opposition to a group. And that's how the Nazi regime began, is that people fell in line and they were more afraid to speak against a group than actually, they were more afraid to speak against a group and do something that's right. And they were actually willing to do something that's wrong because it was part of the group. So what I can tell to the men and women right now in the police department, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. You have to speak up. You have to be respectful. But if your authority gives you something that you believe is immoral and does not follow moral principle, you have to speak out. You have to be part of that 2%. And John and I, we fell part of that 2%. You have to speak out about what's wrong. Speak the truth, even if you find opposition, because in the end, it goes back to what I said. You're going to have to wake up one day and ask yourself, did I do the right thing? Did I take did I take something according to a mandate and violate what I believe in? And John, stood up against that. I myself was offered, I could be a lieutenant in intelligence. I could have ran a detective squad, be off the street, make more money. But I couldn't stay there because on moral principle, I couldn't watch someone else become the next most complained cop. And that's why I wear that moniker, is to protect those cops. They could fire the stuff at me right now and they could attack me all they want. But at the end, and if they're watching this, the only ones they're attacking is themselves. And I'll still continue to help them. I don't believe in changing. I won't change for anyone. I don't fight my fights with hate. I fight them with love. So even though those guys want to attack us, I still love them because I care. They just don't know any better. And I'm confident that one day when they see the light, they're going to apologize to John and I and thank us.
on that note, that concludes what's been an interesting, for sure, and a fun episode 292 of the Mike the Name podcast. I included not only the handles for the Finest Unfiltered, but also your social media handles in the description of this episode. So besides where they can find you, where they can find the Finest Unfiltered, are there any shout outs to anyone or anything that you would like to give?
Absolutely. Absolutely. First of all, if I want to thank John McCary for having the fortitude that he and we teamed up and joined together in doing New York's Finest Retired Unfiltered podcast and getting this message out there and being the catalyst for change on different forefronts. I would not have teamed up with John if I didn't think that we together had moral principle together. So he is the man for the job, and so am I. Together, we make a fantastic team. I believe that we have a great flow, and I think it's important that the both of us continue to do this together. I'd like to give a shout out, of course, to Sal Greco, who's been attacked and just completely faces hypocrisy and losing his career. I'd like to thank Paul Manicone, who holds Just Right PD, who sends a fantastic message. He does the video productions for us. And I'd like to thank Alamo, who is on Twitter and Instagram and does help us with the memes that we get out from the Finest Unfiltered to address our message about what's going on with the police department. And of course, I'd like to thank my family, thank all the Marines that are out there serving, all the veterans, and the police officers that are out there right now. Please, if you're watching us, I thank you for what you do. We will continue to fight when we're out there. Again, Civilian Complaint Review Board, there's a meeting monthly virtually. Please attend and listen to what's going on out there. Have an open mind and open heart. And thank you. And Mike, to yourself, I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak out. And thank you so much.
No problem. Last note to self, don't eat at con sofrito. Whatever you do, don't eat at con sofrito. I've written that down, and next time I'm in the Bronx, I will make sure not to stop there. This has been a great episode.
But last but not least, my family, who's dear and near to me, gives me the support that I can do this. It's so important that we have support out there in the community. So, and today is actually, it's very interesting. I want to say again, thank God for the Marine Corps. Today is 24 years since I stepped on the yellow footprints. Any Marine that watches this, and I embarked on my career and my enlistment, and I joined the Marine Corps, and I went to boot camp. So today is 24 years since I went to boot camp. So thank you for that.
Oh, wow. January 10th, 2000. Interesting correlation there. And on that note, like I said, this wraps up what's been a very interesting episode. Eric, stick around. We'll talk off the air. Thanks to everybody that tuned in tonight via YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Coming up next on the Mike Maven podcast. So he was supposed to come on last month. He ended up getting sick, unfortunately. He's better now. So we'll have him on this Friday. He's currently number 2, I think, in terms of the uniform personnel in the FDNY, and that is current New York City Fire Department Chief of Operations John Esposito, who's going to join me for the milestone volume 50 of another mini-series we have on this show, which is, of course, as you and the audience know, the best of the bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. John's been in the fire service over 30 years and has been Chief of Operations going on 2 years in the FDNY. Does a great job, and looking forward to hearing his stories of what it's been like to be on the streets as a New York City firefighter and, of course, his current role. So in the meantime, on behalf of Lieutenant Special Assignment Eric Dim and the Finest Unfiltered, I am Mike Colón, and we will see you next time. Take care, everybody, and see you Friday. Good night.